Imagine losing everything, your career, your reputation, your closest friendships, all because of one impulsive mistake. Pilot Ethan Grayson had it all until a single moment of misjudgment sent his life into a tailspin. But what if the man he wronged held the key to his redemption? And what if that man was his boss's long-lost father? Buckle up, because this story is about second chances, shattered trust, and the unexpected paths to redemption. Stay with us. This is one flight you won't want to miss. Before we dive in, let us know. What time are you listening to this, and where are you? Drop a comment below. We'd love to hear from you. Ethan Grayson stepped out of the terminal, his breath curling in the cold Chicago air. The biting wind swept through Westbrook International Airport, rattling the metal barriers along the curb where black town cars idled in line. It was the same routine after every long flight: disembark, grab his duffel bag, and head straight to his car. Tonight was no different. The heavy boots of business travelers thudded along the pavement, their hurried voices blending with the occasional honk of a waiting taxi. Near the terminal entrance, a janitor mopped up a spilled coffee, his worn-out expression mirroring the exhaustion Ethan felt after hours in the cockpit. He had just flown in from Los Angeles, a smooth trip with minimal turbulence, yet his body still carried the stiffness of being strapped into his seat for too long. He adjusted his leather jacket, rolling his shoulders back to shake off the weight of fatigue. As he moved toward the private parking lot, a gust of wind carried the unmistakable scent of burnt pretzels and jet fuel, a smell he had long associated with the end of a shift. He fished his phone from his pocket, checking for messages. Nothing important. His boss, Lawrence Mercer, was scheduled for a private flight in a few days, but there were no last-minute changes. That was good. Stability was good. He thrived in it. Then, just as he was about to step off the curb, a voice broke through the hum of the airport's late-night activity. "Excuse me, sir." Ethan turned, already bracing himself. A man stood a few feet away, bundled in layers of mismatched clothing, a tattered scarf wrapped tightly around his neck. His skin was dark, weathered by years of exposure, and his eyes, tired yet oddly sharp, held something Ethan couldn't quite place. He knew where this was going. He had seen it 100 times before. "Sorry, man," Ethan said quickly, sidestepping him. "Can't help you." But the man didn't back off. He raised a gloved hand, palm outward, as if to reassure Ethan he wasn't asking for money. "I just need a moment," the man insisted, his voice raspy but calm. Ethan exhaled sharply, impatience creeping in. He had no energy for this. Not tonight. "Look, I don't have cash," he muttered, shifting his bag onto his other shoulder. The man's lips pressed together for a second, as if weighing his next words. "It's not about, yeah, well, I'm not interested." Ethan's tone was sharper now. The exhaustion, the cold, the need to just be home, it all piled up, making him more irritated than he normally would be. The man hesitated. His expression flickered, just for a second. Disappointment? Annoyance? Ethan couldn't tell. Then just like that, the moment passed. The man took a step back, nodding once, as if to silently accept Ethan's dismissal. Ethan didn't give it a second thought. He turned and strode toward the parking lot, the encounter already slipping from his mind. Another night, another stranger, another interaction that didn't mean a damn thing. But as he reached his car and pressed the unlock button, he found himself glancing over his shoulder. The man was still there, standing beneath the airport's fluorescent lights, hands tucked into his coat. He wasn't looking at Ethan anymore. Instead, he turned and walked toward a row of benches, his pace slow, deliberate. Ethan shook his head and climbed into his car, slamming the door shut. He didn't owe anyone anything. And yet, as he pulled out of the lot and merged onto the highway, a small, inexplicable weight settled in his chest. He ignored it. After all, it was just another night, just another airport, just another face he'd never see again, or so he thought. The cold hadn't let up by the time Ethan pulled into the VIP parking section. The low hum of his car's engine filled the space as he turned off the ignition, the silence settling heavily around him. He was about to get out when movement caught his eye. Near the far end of the lot, past the rows of luxury sedans and town cars, the same man from earlier stood by a silver Mercedes, one of the privately chauffeured vehicles assigned to Mercer Aviation's clients. Ethan frowned. What the hell was he doing there? The man wasn't touching the car, wasn't trying to break in. He just stood there looking down at something in his hands. A moment passed, then another. Ethan knew he should just leave, walk away. But something about the man's stillness, the way his shoulders hunched slightly against the wind, made irritation flare in Ethan's chest. He had seen plenty of con artists in the city, people who lingered in high-end areas, preying on sympathy. This wasn't his problem. Still, his feet moved before his mind could stop them. "Hey!" he called out, his voice cutting through the cold night air. The man's head snapped up. Ethan marched toward him, the crunch of gravel beneath his boots sharp and deliberate. "You need to go," he said firmly. "This is private property." The man's expression didn't change. He nodded slightly but didn't move. Ethan narrowed his eyes. "I mean it," he pressed. "You can't just—" "I wasn't doing anything," the man said, his tone level. Ethan scoffed. "Right. So you just happened to be standing next to a six-figure car in a private parking lot?" The man exhaled, shaking his head slightly. "I was just—" Ethan had heard enough. He reached out, grabbing the man's coat sleeve, intending to pull him back toward the terminal's main exit. It was a mistake. The man instinctively yanked away, and in that split second, Ethan reacted. A surge of frustration, maybe even anger, fueled his next move. His fist connected before he could think. The punch wasn't his hardest, but it landed squarely against the man's shoulder, knocking him off balance. He stumbled, catching himself against the car before sinking to one knee. For a moment, neither of them moved. Ethan's pulse pounded in his ears. His breath came in short bursts, misting in the cold air. The man, still on the ground, slowly looked up. And in that moment, something shifted. There was no outrage in his gaze, no shock, just a tired, knowing resignation. Ethan clenched his jaw, suddenly unsure of himself. Then from behind them, the shuffle of footsteps echoed in the lot. "Everything okay here?" Ethan turned sharply. A security guard, Paul Miller, stood a few feet away, his flashlight beam cutting through the dimly lit lot. Ethan straightened, exhaling sharply. "Yeah," he said too quickly. "Everything's fine." Paul's gaze drifted from Ethan to the man on the ground. For a long, tense second, nobody spoke. Then, without a word, the man pushed himself to his feet. He brushed off his coat, took one last look at Ethan, something unreadable in his expression, then turned and walked away. Paul watched him go before glancing back at Ethan. "I wouldn't have done that," he said quietly. Ethan bristled. "He was loitering. Could have been trying to—" Paul shook his head. "Number he wasn't." Ethan swallowed, suddenly feeling exposed. Paul let the silence hang for a moment before stepping past him. "Go home, Grayson." Ethan stood frozen as Paul disappeared into the shadows. Then finally he moved. He didn't look back. And yet, as he climbed into his car once more, the weight in his chest felt heavier than before. Ethan barely remembered the drive home. The roads were mostly empty, city lights flickering against the rain-speckled windshield as he navigated through the quiet streets of Chicago. But his mind was anything but quiet. The man's face lingered in his thoughts the way he had looked up at him. Not with anger, not with fear, but with something far worse. Acceptance. Ethan exhaled sharply, gripping the steering wheel tighter. It was ridiculous. He had done nothing wrong. The guy had been in a restricted area, standing too close to a car that wasn't his. He had ignored Ethan's warnings. And yet, the moment replayed in his head, over and over, like a bad song stuck on repeat. The way the man had simply dusted himself off and walked away. The way Paul had looked at Ethan, disappointment clear in his voice. Ethan tried to push it aside, focusing on the road. He wasn't the kind of guy who lost sleep over things like this. He had spent years perfecting the ability to shut out distractions, to keep himself focused on what mattered. By the time he pulled into the underground parking garage of his apartment building, his jaw ached from clenching it too hard. He killed the engine, sat there for a moment, fingers drumming against the steering wheel. The silence inside the car was almost suffocating. With a sigh, he grabbed his bag and headed upstairs. His apartment was a sleek, modern space on the 24th floor, all glass windows and minimalistic furniture. It was the kind of place that looked impressive but never really felt like home. He tossed his keys onto the kitchen counter, and made a beeline for the fridge, grabbing a bottle of water. The cool liquid did little to clear the unease still coiled in his chest. Ethan had always been good at compartmentalizing, at filing away things that didn't serve him. But tonight, for some reason, his mind wouldn't cooperate. He glanced at his reflection in the window, the city stretching out behind him. His face looked the same as always. Sharp jaw, short-cropped dark hair, tired eyes. But there was something in his expression that unsettled him. He took a sip of water, then set the bottle down with more force than necessary. Maybe he just needed sleep. Maybe by morning, all of this would feel as insignificant as it should, but deep down, a part of him wasn't so sure. Morning came with the sharp sound of his phone vibrating against the nightstand. Ethan groaned, blindly reaching for it. "Yeah?" His voice was thick with sleep. "Hope I didn't wake you," a familiar voice said. Ethan rubbed his eyes, glancing at the time. It was barely past 7. "Lawrence," he muttered, sitting up. "What's going on?" "I need you at the office," Lawrence said, his tone calm but firm. "Something's come up." Ethan frowned, running a hand through his hair. Lawrence wasn't the type to call this early unless it was important. "Be there in 30, Ethan said, already swinging his legs out of bed. By the time he arrived at Mercer Aviation's downtown office, the city was alive with morning traffic, people moving with purpose through the bustling streets. He stepped into the sleek glass building, nodding at the receptionist before taking the elevator up to the executive floor. Lawrence was waiting for him in his office, standing by the window with a cup of coffee in hand. The older man was always impeccably dressed, his tailored suit crisp despite the early hour. Ethan dropped into the chair across from him. "All right, what's the emergency?" Lawrence turned, setting his coffee down. "I got a call this morning," he said, "from a private investigator." Ethan's brows pulled together. "A pie? What for?" Lawrence leaned back against his desk, crossing his arms. "I hired him a while ago to look for someone. My father." Ethan froze. For a moment, the air felt too thick, the office too quiet. Lawrence had never talked much about his father. Ethan had always assumed the man had died years ago, or that they had some falling out Lawrence preferred not to discuss. "He disappeared over 30 years ago," Lawrence continued. "Walked out one night and never came back. We thought he might have died, but, well, we finally found something." Ethan's grip on the armrest tightened. "What kind of something?" The corner of Lawrence's mouth twitched. Not quite a smile, not quite a frown. "There's a strong lead that he's been living on the streets, possibly in Chicago." Ethan felt his stomach drop. The words barely registered at first, his brain struggling to piece them together. Living on the streets. In Chicago. A sharp, unwanted memory surged forward. The man at the airport, his tired eyes, his resigned expression. Number it couldn't be. Ethan forced himself to keep his expression neutral. "You're sure it's him?" Lawrence nodded. The PI found an old employment record matching his name, Samuel Whitaker. He used to be an engineer at a small aircraft manufacturing company. Got injured, lost his job, and then, he exhaled. "Well, you know how these things go." Ethan did, and suddenly he wanted nothing more than to be anywhere but in this room. Lawrence picked up a file from his desk and handed it over. "Here, some of the recent photos they got. They think he's been staying near the airport." Ethan's hand hovered over the file for a second too long before he finally took it. He didn't need to open it. He already knew what he would see. Still, he forced himself to look, and there he was. The man from last night, Samuel Whitaker. Ethan's mouth went dry. His pulse hammered in his ears so loud he barely heard Lawrence's next words. "I want to find him, Ethan. I want to bring him home." Ethan swallowed, his throat tight. His world had just tilted on its axis, and for the first time in his life, he had no idea what the hell he was supposed to do next. Ethan could barely feel his fingers as he closed the file. His skin had gone cold, his thoughts tangled into knots so tight he couldn't undo them. Lawrence had no idea that just last night, the man he had been searching for, the father he thought he'd lost forever, had been knocked to the ground by none other than Ethan himself. The air in the office felt suddenly too thick, like the walls were pressing in. He forced himself to take a slow breath, schooling his expression into something neutral. Lawrence, oblivious to the storm brewing inside Ethan's chest, continued. The PI said they've spotted him near Westbrook International a few times. No consistent pattern, but he tends to stick to the same few blocks. We need to act fast before he moves again. Ethan swallowed hard. And what's the plan? Lawrence leaned forward, resting his hands on his desk. I need to go find him. I can't just sit here knowing he's out there. Ethan's stomach twisted. If Lawrence found Sam, if he spoke to him, there was no telling what would happen. Sam could expose everything in a second. He cleared his throat, trying to keep his voice steady. Do you think he'd even want to be found? The question made Lawrence pause. I don't know, he admitted, but I have to try. He was my father before he was a man without a home. Whatever happened to him, he deserves more than this. Ethan gritted his teeth. His whole life, he had prided himself on being a man of control, a man who made the right moves, avoided costly mistakes. But now, he was standing at the edge of a cliff, and the ground beneath him was crumbling fast. If Sam told Lawrence what had happened, no, he couldn't let that happen. Ethan forced a casual shrug. All right, so what do you need from me? Lawrence exhaled. I want you to come with me. Ethan's heartbeat stuttered. I'll take care of the logistics, but I need someone I trust at my side. And you know the airport better than I do. You fly in and out of there all the time. If he's been seen around Westbrook, you might recognize something I'd miss. Ethan barely heard the rest. The weight of the moment pressed down on him, heavier than anything he had ever felt in the cockpit at 35,000 feet. Lawrence was asking him to help find the man he had assaulted. A man who could, at any second, tell Lawrence the truth and destroy everything Ethan had built. He had no choice. He had to get ahead of this. So he forced a nod, even as his stomach churned. All right, he said, his voice steady despite the chaos inside him. Let's find your father. The Chicago air was colder than the night before, the wind sharp as it whipped through the streets. Lawrence drove with precision, his hands gripping the steering wheel a little too tightly. Ethan sat in the passenger seat, staring out the window as the city blurred past. His mind was a battlefield, one half strategizing, the other drowning in guilt. They had barely spoken since leaving Mercer Aviation. Lawrence was too focused, too lost in thought. And Ethan? He was trying to figure out how the hell he was supposed to get through the next few hours without his entire world collapsing. Lawrence finally broke the silence. We'll start near the terminal where he was last seen. Ethan gave a stiff nod. He was running out of time. He needed to find Sam first, needed to talk to him before Lawrence did. They pulled into a parking lot across from the main terminal. The airport buzzed with life, travelers rushing in and out, cab drivers shouting, rolling suitcases clicking against the pavement. It was a place of movement, of transition, a place no one ever really noticed unless they had somewhere to be. But tonight, they weren't looking for someone trying to get somewhere. They were looking for someone who had nowhere left to go. Lawrence scanned the area, his eyes sharp. We start on foot. Ethan nodded again, but his chest felt tight. They moved through the sidewalks near the airport, passing food carts, benches, and small clusters of people waiting for rides. The city's lights cast a dull glow over everything, and the distant sound of airplane engines rumbled through the air. Lawrence was methodical. He stopped to talk to a few people, security guards, vendors, even a barista at a nearby coffee stand. Most of them had seen homeless people around, but weren't sure if they had seen Sam specifically. As they turned a corner, Ethan spotted a familiar figure in the distance, near the covered bus stop by the long-term parking lot. Sam. The old man sat hunched on a bench, his hands clasped together for warmth. His worn coat was pulled tightly around him, and his eyes were fixed on something far away, lost in thought. Ethan's pulse spiked. Lawrence hadn't seen him yet. This was it, his only chance to get to Sam first. He exhaled, forcing calm into his voice. Why don't you check that side of the lot? I'll look over here. Lawrence didn't question it. He nodded and walked in the opposite direction, leaving Ethan alone. Ethan turned towards Sam, his steps quick but controlled. His heart pounded as he reached the bench. Sam didn't look up at first. He must have sensed someone approaching, but he didn't react. When he finally did lift his gaze, his expression didn't change. There was no anger, no surprise, just that same damn look of tired acceptance. Ethan swallowed hard. We need to talk. Sam held his stare for a long moment, then gave a slow nod. Yeah, he said quietly. I think we do. Ethan sat down beside him, his breath misting in the cold air. For the first time in a long time, he didn't know what to say, and that scared him more than anything else. Ethan sat stiffly on the cold metal bench, his hands clasped together between his knees. The distant hum of traffic and the occasional whoosh of a plane taking off filled the silence between them. Sam hadn't moved much since Ethan sat down. He didn't seem surprised, didn't look angry. That made it worse. Ethan had expected something. Accusations, bitterness, a demand for an apology. But instead, Sam just sat there, his posture relaxed, as if he had already accepted whatever would happen next. Ethan cleared his throat. I didn't know who you were. Sam let out a short, dry chuckle. That's supposed to make it better? Ethan flinched at the bluntness, but knew he deserved it. He hesitated, his fingers tightening around each other. I wasn't thinking, Ethan admitted. I saw you near the car. I assumed the worst, and I reacted. Sam finally turned his head to look at him. His eyes weren't sharp or accusing, just tired. You assumed because I look like this, Sam said, gesturing vaguely to his worn-out clothes, his unshaven face, that I was up to something. Ethan didn't have an excuse, because Sam was right. I get it, Sam continued before Ethan could respond. I see the way people look at me. I stopped fighting it a long time ago. Ethan swallowed the lump in his throat. That doesn't make what I did okay. Sam exhaled, rubbing his gloved hands together for warmth. No, it doesn't, but it also doesn't change much for me. Ethan's stomach twisted. He had expected anger, but this quiet indifference was somehow worse. After a moment, Sam spoke again. So, why are you really here? Ethan hesitated. He knew what Sam was really asking. You don't want Lawrence to know, Sam guessed. His voice wasn't accusing, just observant. Ethan exhaled slowly. I don't know what I want. Sam chuckled, but it held no humor. Then you're in trouble, son. The words hit Ethan harder than they should have. I don't expect you to forgive me, Ethan admitted. He struggled to find the words, running a hand down his face. Lawrence, he's looking for you. He's here. Right now. Sam stiffened just slightly. Not fear, not panic, but something flickered in his expression. Ethan watched him carefully. He wants to bring you home. For the first time, Sam looked away, his jaw tightening. I don't have a home, he said, his voice quieter. Ethan frowned. You have him, and he wants to see you. Sam let out a slow breath. And what about you? Ethan tensed. What about me? Sam studied him, as if deciding something. Then after a long moment, he shook his head. I'll talk to him, Sam finally said. But not here. Not tonight. Ethan hesitated. Why? Sam didn't answer right away. He shifted, stretching his hands as if they ached. Because some things take time, he murmured. Ethan didn't understand, but he nodded anyway. Okay. Sam glanced toward the parking lot, his expression unreadable. You better go before he finds us here. Ethan hesitated. He wanted to say something more, but the words wouldn't come. So he stood up, stuffing his hands in his pockets. You'll let me know when you're ready? He asked. Sam gave him a knowing look. You'll know. Ethan wasn't sure what that meant, but for now it was enough. Ethan found Lawrence standing near the entrance of the parking lot, his hands shoved into his coat pockets as he scanned the area. His sharp gaze locked onto Ethan the second he approached. Well? Lawrence asked. Anything? Ethan forced a shake of his head. Not yet, Lawrence exhaled, rubbing his temple. Damn. For the first time, Ethan really saw the weight on Lawrence's shoulders. He had always known his boss as the composed, controlled businessman, never someone who let personal matters shake him. But this was different. Maybe we're looking in the wrong places, Lawrence muttered half to himself. If he's not staying near the terminal, maybe he's further into the city. Ethan hesitated. He could stop this now. Tell Lawrence the truth. Lead him back to Sam. But instead he said, We'll find him. Lawrence nodded, determination hardening his features. Yeah, we will. As they left the airport behind, Ethan couldn't shake the feeling that everything had just gotten a whole lot more complicated, and somehow he knew this was only the beginning. Ethan had barely slept. His mind kept running in circles, replaying his conversation with Sam, the weight of his lie to Lawrence pressing down on him like a boulder. He sat in his car outside Mercer Aviation the next morning, gripping the steering wheel, trying to convince himself that he still had control over the situation. He had bought himself a little time, but time was running out. Lawrence wasn't the kind of man who gave up. He was relentless. The more dead ends they hit, the more determined he would become. It wasn't a question of if he would find Sam, it was when. Ethan exhaled sharply, shoving open the door and stepping into the crisp morning air. Inside, the office hummed with its usual energy. Pilots checking schedules, assistants rushing between desks, the low murmur of phone calls filling the air. Lawrence was in his office, staring at a map spread across his desk when Ethan walked in. I made some calls last night, Lawrence said without looking up. There's a shelter downtown. One of the workers there thinks they saw him a few weeks ago. Ethan forced himself to stay composed. That's something. Lawrence nodded. We're heading there in an hour. I already cleared my schedule. Ethan's pulse quickened. Another search. Another chance for everything to blow up in his face. Lawrence finally looked at him, his expression unreadable. You okay? Ethan swallowed. Yeah, just long night. Lawrence studied him for a moment before nodding. Good, because today we find him. Ethan clenched his jaw. Not if I find him first. The shelter was a modest, aging building on the outskirts of downtown. A faded blue sign above the door read, Hope Haven Community Center. Ethan and Lawrence stepped inside, the scent of coffee and disinfectant filling the air. A few people sat at tables in the main room, some eating, others chatting in hushed tones. A woman at the front desk looked up as they approached. Morning, Lawrence said smoothly, flashing one of his polished smiles. I'm looking for someone. I was told he might have been here. The woman, mid-40s with tired eyes and a clipboard in hand, gave them a cautious glance. We don't usually give out information about our guests. Lawrence pulled out his phone and tapped the screen, showing her a picture of Sam. I'm his son. Her eyes flickered with something. Recognition? Surprise? Ethan held his breath. She hesitated, then sighed. Yeah, he was here, but not for long. Came in, got some food, left before nightfall. Lawrence straightened. When was this? Few weeks back, maybe 3. Lawrence ran a hand down his face. Damn. Ethan shifted his weight. This was his chance to steer the conversation away from Sam, to keep Lawrence off the right trail. But before he could, the woman glanced at him and said, You look familiar. Ethan's stomach dropped. Do I? He said carefully. She nodded. Yeah, he mentioned you. Lawrence's head snapped toward Ethan. Ethan froze. What? She frowned, flipping through her notes. A few nights ago, he said something about a pilot at the airport. Lawrence's sharp gaze locked onto Ethan. You've seen him? Ethan's mind raced. Every nerve in his body screamed at him to lie, to spin some story. But it was too late. Lawrence had already seen it in his face. You knew. Lawrence's voice was quiet, but there was a dangerous edge to it. Ethan swallowed hard. It's not. How long? Lawrence demanded, his tone now cold. How long have you known where he was? Ethan clenched his fists. There was no way out of this. No escape from the inevitable. So he did the only thing left to do. He told the truth. The shelter faded around them as Ethan exhaled and said the words that would change everything. I saw him 2 nights ago. Lawrence's expression darkened. Ethan took a breath, bracing himself, because this was only the beginning. The silence that followed was suffocating. Lawrence's jaw tightened, his eyes locked onto Ethan's with an intensity that sent a cold chill through him. The energy in the shelter seemed to shift, the low hum of conversation in the background, fading beneath the weight of Lawrence's disbelief. You saw him, Lawrence repeated, his voice eerily steady. 2 nights ago. Ethan forced himself to hold his gaze. Yes. Lawrence exhaled slowly, a bitter smile creeping onto his face. But it wasn't amusement. It was something much sharper, something that could cut. You lied to me. Ethan's stomach twisted. I didn't. Don't, Lawrence snapped, his patience shattering. Don't insult me with excuses. People at nearby tables had begun to glance their way, sensing the rising tension. The woman at the front desk shifted uncomfortably but didn't intervene. Lawrence's fingers curled into fists, his body rigid with restrained anger. You knew I was looking for him. You knew how important this was to me, and instead of telling me, you... He let out a humorless laugh, shaking his head. Unbelievable. Ethan clenched his jaw. I was trying to... What? Lawrence cut in, his voice sharp. Protect me? Protect yourself? Ethan flinched at the second accusation because that was the real answer, wasn't it? This had never been about doing the right thing. It had been about protecting himself, his job, his reputation. Lawrence took a slow step back, as if seeing Ethan in a completely different light. You weren't just keeping this from me, were you? His voice was quieter now, but no less dangerous. Something happened. Ethan swallowed. Lawrence! What did you do? The question was a demand, not a request. Ethan's mind raced. He could keep lying, could twist the truth into something more digestible. But Lawrence was too sharp, too perceptive. He already suspected. And deep down, Ethan knew there was no way out of this. He closed his eyes for a brief moment, forcing himself to say it. I hit him. The words landed like a gunshot. Lawrence's expression froze, the color draining from his face. The shelter, the people, the world around them ceased to exist. There was only that moment, only the suffocating weight of what had just been revealed. Ethan felt his heart hammering in his chest, but he didn't look away. He owed Lawrence at least that much. For several seconds, Lawrence didn't move, didn't speak, just stared at him, his breathing controlled, too controlled. Then, without warning, he turned and walked toward the door. Ethan's stomach dropped. Lawrence! But Lawrence didn't stop, didn't even look back. Ethan hesitated for only a second before following, because he knew if he didn't fix this now, he might never get the chance. The air outside was sharp, the wind biting against Ethan's face as he hurried after Lawrence. Wait, Ethan called, but Lawrence kept walking, his steps purposeful, controlled, too controlled. Ethan finally caught up, grabbing his arm. Lawrence, just... The moment his fingers tightened, Lawrence turned on him, his expression unreadable. Ethan let go immediately, but the damage was done. Lawrence's voice was dangerously low when he spoke. You put your hands on my father. Ethan inhaled sharply. I didn't know it was him. Does that make it better? Lawrence asked, his tone laced with quiet fury. Ethan's throat tightened. But I didn't do it out of malice. Out of what then? Lawrence snapped. Out of instinct? Out of disgust? Ethan felt the accusation like a punch to the gut. That's not... Tell me. Lawrence cut him off, his voice quieter now, but no less cutting. When you looked at him that night, what did you see? Ethan opened his mouth, but no words came, because he knew the answer, and so did Lawrence. That's what I thought, Lawrence muttered. He exhaled sharply, running a hand through his hair. I trusted you, Ethan. I put my faith in you. And this is what you were hiding from me? Ethan's stomach twisted. I never meant for any of this to happen. Lawrence let out a humorless laugh. I'm sure you didn't. The silence stretched between them, heavy and unrelenting. Finally, Lawrence shook his head. I don't even know who you are anymore. Ethan flinched. That's not fair, isn't it? Lawrence's eyes were cold now. Because from where I'm standing, it's exactly fair. Ethan had no response to that. After a long pause, Lawrence exhaled, his voice quieter now. You're off the flight schedule. Ethan's chest constricted. Lawrence, don't. Lawrence's tone held no room for argument. You're done. And with that, he turned and walked away, leaving Ethan standing there in the freezing air, his world crumbling around him. For the first time in his life, Ethan had lost control, and he had no idea how to get it back. Ethan sat in his car, gripping the steering wheel so tightly his knuckles turned white. The streetlights outside flickered against the windshield, casting long shadows across the dashboard. His ears were still ringing from Lawrence's words. "You're done." It shouldn't have hit him this hard. It was just a job, just another flight. He could find work somewhere else. He had the experience, the reputation. At least he had a reputation. But it wasn't just the job. It was Lawrence. The trust he had shattered, the look in his boss's eyes when the truth came out. Ethan had spent years building his career, crafting the image of a man who had everything under control. And in one reckless moment, he had destroyed it. He took a shaky breath, his mind racing through possibilities. He could leave Chicago, start over somewhere else. But no, he wasn't the type to run. Not yet, at least. His fingers drummed against the wheel. There was still one thing left to do. Sam. Ethan had to find him again. Not to fix things with Lawrence. He knew that was beyond repair for now. But because, for the first time, he felt the weight of what he had done in a way that no excuse could erase. He had knocked a man to the ground, not just any man, that man. And if there was even a small chance of making it right, he had to take it. Ethan wasn't sure where to start. Sam had disappeared again, which wasn't surprising. The homeless community in Chicago was like a shifting tide. People moved, sought shelter where they could, avoided attention. Still, he checked the last place they had talked, the covered bus stop near the airport's long-term parking lot. Empty. He checked the alley near the shelter, the one where Sam had been spotted weeks before. Nothing. Hours passed. The sky darkened. The city lights flickered on, neon signs buzzing in the night. And then, just as he was about to give up, he saw him. Sam was sitting on the cold pavement near a closed storefront, his back against the brick wall, hands tucked into the pockets of his worn coat. He wasn't asleep, just staring at something unseen, lost in thought. Ethan hesitated. He wasn't sure what to say. He had spent years perfecting his ability to talk his way out of things, but this wasn't something he could spin or reframe. There were no quick fixes here, so he took a breath, stepped forward, and said the only thing he could. "I'm sorry." Sam didn't react right away. His gaze flicked up, settling on Ethan with mild curiosity, as if waiting for something more. Ethan exhaled. "Not just for what happened that night," he admitted, "for everything, for assuming the worst about you, for not seeing you as a person." Sam studied him for a long moment. Then to Ethan's surprise, he let out a quiet chuckle. "Well," Sam said, shifting slightly. "Took you long enough." Ethan blinked. "Excuse me?" Sam shrugged. "You're not the first man to hit me, kid. Won't be the last. But I'll tell you what is different." Ethan waited. "You came back," Sam said simply. "Most people wouldn't." Ethan swallowed. "Does that mean anything?" Sam tilted his head. "Depends. Are you here for me, or are you here to make yourself feel better?" Ethan opened his mouth, then closed it, because the truth was, he wasn't sure. Sam smiled, but it wasn't mocking, it was knowing. "Thought so." Ethan exhaled, dropping down to sit on the curb beside him. The concrete was cold beneath him, the city alive with distant traffic, muffled conversations from the next block over. For a long time, neither of them spoke. And maybe that was okay, because for the first time, Ethan wasn't trying to control the situation. He was just there, and somehow that felt like a start. Ethan didn't expect anything to change overnight. He didn't expect Lawrence to call, didn't expect forgiveness, didn't expect some grand, dramatic resolution. But what did happen was this. One evening, a few days after his talk with Sam, his phone buzzed. He hesitated before picking it up. "Lawrence." Ethan stared at the name on the screen for a long moment before answering. "Hey." Silence. Then finally Lawrence spoke. "My father told me he spoke to you." Ethan's stomach clenched. "Yeah?" Another pause. Then Lawrence sighed. "I'm still mad." Ethan swallowed. "I know. But," Lawrence continued, his voice quieter, "he asked me to give you another chance." Ethan's breath hitched. Sam. Of all people, Sam had been the one to speak for him. "I'm not saying things go back to the way they were," Lawrence warned, But if you're willing to prove to me that you're not the man I thought you were that night, we'll see." Ethan nodded, even though Lawrence couldn't see him. "I will," he said, and for the first time, he meant it. A week later, Ethan stood in front of a private hangar, the cool wind rustling his jacket. Sam and Lawrence stood a few feet away, the father and son still learning how to bridge the years of separation. But they were trying. And Ethan, he wasn't the same man who had walked through the airport that night, blind to the world outside of his own. He didn't know where this road would take him, but for the first time in his life, he was ready to find out. He looked at Sam one last time before stepping onto the jet, gripping the controls and preparing for takeoff. Because some journeys didn't happen in the air. Some journeys happened within. Life has a way of testing us in unexpected ways. Sometimes we make mistakes that seem impossible to fix. But as Ethan learned, redemption isn't about undoing the past. It's about the choices we make moving forward. Trust can be broken, but can it be rebuilt? Would you have forgiven Ethan if you were in Lawrence's shoes? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. And if you love stories that challenge perspectives and explore the power of second chances, make sure to subscribe. We've got more powerful narratives coming your way. Don't miss out.